Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to this very special online event, not the Oxford Conference. My name is Robert Evans, and in a more normal year, I'd be looking forward to welcoming you to this year's 48th Oxford Planning Law Conference in the beautiful surroundings of New College and the Oxford Union in Oxford. Sadly, we had to make the decision some time ago to cancel this year's conference for hopefully obvious reasons, but we are delighted to be holding this, as I say, special online event instead. And we're particularly delighted to have reached already over 900 delegates who have registered for the Vimeo live stream. Before I turn to this year's programme, I hope you will permit a short plug for next year's conference. We are looking forward already to hosting the 49th Oxford Planning Law Conference next year, opening on Friday the 17th of September and running through to Sunday the 19th of September 2021. It's certain to be a really key conference held amidst the government's clear determination to radically alter the UK planning system, which we will of course touch on today. The full programme and booking form for next year's event will be emailed to registered delegates later this year or early next. So please watch out for that. Turning to this afternoon, the programme is in two parts. In part one, we'll be hearing from Lord Kerslake and Baroness Brown. Lord Kerslake is obviously a member of the House of Lords. He's also a Knight of the Realm, former head of the Civil Service and chair of UK 2070 Commission. Lord Kerslake will be speaking about his role in the Commission, its 10-point plan for addressing deep-seated regional inequalities, and how that plan can also help us address the impact of COVID-19. He'll also be setting out his own thoughts on the government's planning white paper. Baroness Brown of Cambridge will be speaking about climate change. Her Twitter account tells me that her interests include engineering, diversity, higher education, manufacturing industry, and innovation. And she combines all of that with a very heavy-duty job as Vice Chair of the UK Committee on Climate Change and Chair of its Adaptation Committee. She'll be explaining how climate change may present a greater global risk than a pandemic, or financial failure, or cyber attack. And she'll also outline 6 urgent priorities for the UK and the important role of the UK planning system. So that part one will be chaired by Hashi Mohammed, barrister, broadcaster, international man of mystery, and author of People Like Us, What It Takes to Make It in Modern Britain. Hashi told me earlier that his birthday was yesterday and that his book is available on Amazon for £12.99. So I took that as a shameless attempt to persuade me to buy his very excellent book. Part two, we chaired by Mary Cook, my fellow member of the JPLC committee, barrister and partner at Town Legal. And she will introduce and put questions to Jonathan Easton, barrister for King's Chambers in Manchester. Jonathan will be presenting the legal update, which many of you know is an absolute cornerstone of the Oxford Planning Law Conference programme. The full legal update from Jonathan will be published in the Sweet and Maxwell Journal of Planning and Environmental Law in their October issue, and it will also then appear later on the JPLC website, around April next year. That's an appropriate time to mention our sponsor, Thomson Reuters Sweet and Maxwell. They've very kindly supported this event, and they've always supported our conference in the past. So we're going to encourage you to ask questions today. There will be a function that opens up on the Vimeo stream at the end of each session that allows you to ask questions. Please do give us your name and where you're from as an organisation, and that will allow Hashi and Mary as our chairs to pick the best questions available. 2 things will happen as our proceedings close today. First, you will get a link and a password to download today's presentations. Secondly, you will get a survey form from SurveyMonkey. Please do give us your feedback. This is the first time we've done this event, and we'd always like to improve this event and, of course, the main conference. Finally, thank you to all of our speakers and chairs for taking part today. We're enormously grateful for all of their hard work and their contributions. I'd also like to thank those that have made this technical event possible, Quadrilect, Souk, and Henley Theatre Services. And without any further ado, over to Hashi Mohammed.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, Robert, and for the plug that I didn't actually make, but you did for me anyway. The first speaker I have the pleasure of introducing is Lord Kerslake from Sheffield today, where he'll be joining us live for a Q&A in a moment. But first, we're going to hear from him through his presentation from his very well-watered garden. A few words about Lord Kerslake. He has obviously a hugely distinguished career, and I'll just give you a few highlights in addition to what Robert has said. He was the chair of Peabody, chair of Be First, the Barking and Dagenham Council's Regeneration Company, chair of New Economics Foundation, and the president of the Local Government Association. He was also recently appointed as the chair of the Stockport Mayoral Development Corporation. But just to add also to his recent role of the UK 2070 Commission, which he chairs, that's there to conduct a particularly important review at this stage of the policy and spatial issues related to the UK's long-term city and regional development. His lecture today is titled "The Role of Planning in Rebalancing the UK Economy."
Good afternoon, and can I say thank you for inviting me to speak to your conference today. I'm particularly delighted to be speaking alongside Julia, who is one of the most respected peers in the House of Lords, particularly on the issue of climate change. In my speech, I want to cover three things: the work of the UK 2070 Commission on rebalancing or levelling up the economy, the role of planning in delivering this levelling up agenda, and my thoughts on the government's white paper on planning. Before I do this, though, I did want, as a former head of the civil service, to register my serious concern about the recent resignation of Sir Jonathan Jones as the Treasury Solicitor, apparently due to his concerns over provisions in the government's internal market bill. Sir Jonathan was appointed to his role when I was head of the civil service, and is both a very able lawyer and a consummate professional. However, he would not have been willing to countenance breaching a legally binding agreement, even in specific and limited ways, and I have to say neither should the government. I hope that this can be put right during the passage of the bill through Parliament. Turning now to the UK 2070 Commission, it might seem odd during the COVID emergency for me to be talking about a commission into spatial inequalities that is consciously looking long game, looking back 50 years and forward 50 years, hence the title. However, for reasons I hope I'll make clear in my speech, it is indeed highly relevant that we think about these issues of spatial inequality, and in particular how they sit alongside the need for us to recover from the economic impact of this terrible virus. The Commission's first report was published in May of last year, and it provoked a considerable response. Yet the existence of regional inequalities was hardly new. What was striking about our report, I think, was the comprehensive evidence that we produced about the depth and direction of those inequalities, and the continuing economic and social consequences, and indeed political consequences for this country if we do not tackle those inequalities. The comparison work done by Professor Philip McCann at Sheffield University showed that on a basket of 28 indicators, the UK came 28th out of 30 countries in terms of spatial inequalities. And then building on that, the modelling work by Dr. Ying Jin at Cambridge University showed that on a high growth scenario, over half of the new jobs would go to London and the wider southeast, reinforcing and indeed increasing the level of inequality. Now, this might look like good news for the south, but the consequences of the growing imbalance are bad for everyone. In higher growth scenarios, we see increasing travel problems and congestion, higher levels of costs of housing, and growing environmental pressures. In a low growth scenario, some areas of the country even go backwards. So in short, everybody loses from this inequality. What particularly hit home in our report was the comparison with Germany, which seemed to have made much better progress, albeit not complete, in closing the gap between West and East following reunification. Let me just give you one further statistic from the Commission that captures the scale of the challenge. Jobs growth in London and the South East in the last 10 years has been more than twice the rate of the North. And that's a difference of 1 million jobs being created. Now, our final report was published on the 27th of February this year, just before coronavirus took over as the dominant news item. The focus of our final report was action. We set out a 10-point plan to reverse the trend in growing inequalities and to rebalance the UK. Let me just briefly summarise those 10 actions. Number 1, ensuring explicit spatial dimensions to the plans to get to zero carbon by 2050. We need that to be a just transition in every sense of that word. Number 2, delivering a transformed public transport network between cities, within cities and beyond cities. Number 3, creating new networks of research and development excellence to complement the so-called Golden Triangle of London, Oxford and Cambridge. Number 4, strengthening the foundations of our local economies, tasking local leaders to produce inclusive growth plans. Number 5, recognising housing as part of our national infrastructure and planning now for the housing consequences of successful levelling up. Number 6, harnessing our cultural and environmental assets outside London, which receive disproportionately less money than London does. Number 7, devolving more powers and funding away from Whitehall. Number 8, developing a national plan to raise attainment and ensure that we have the skills for the future. Number 9, tripling the so-called Shared Prosperity Fund to 15 billion per annum, whilst ensuring fair access to those funds. And number 10, tasking the National Infrastructure Commission to produce a national spatial plan. We argued in our final report to achieve this scale of change required changes in the way we do things as well as what we do. And we set out in our report some changes in the way the governance of this country need to happen. We argued for a national outcomes framework, strong political leadership, and a powerful cross-departmental committee, as well as a dedicated national team working with those locally to deliver the Levelling Up programme across government. Now, in between the first and the final report, a new Conservative government was elected with a pledge to level up the country. We welcome that pledge as a commission, but we argued for it to have any practical effect, the government needed to have a large-scale, comprehensive and long-term plan. Anything less than this would raise expectations without delivering. In short, the government needed to go big or go home. Now, dealing with the challenges of Brexit and now coronavirus have undoubtedly had some impact on the government's capacity to prepare such a plan. But the need for a plan remains no less urgent. Indeed, it is essential for levelling up to be a meaningful concept at all. During the lockdown, the Commission has not stood still. We've produced 2 sets of think pieces, articles on different dimensions of the levelling up agenda. And we've also worked on a further report to explore in more depth the impact of COVID-19. We'll be publishing that later this autumn. The key point to be aware of from this is that a levelling up agenda is even more urgent if we're going to build our way out of the consequences of COVID-19. I'd like now to turn to the second of my themes, spatial planning. As I said earlier, one of the recommendations of our report was that England should have a national spatial plan as exists in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and indeed much of Europe. This would provide a vital context for decisions on infrastructure and development. And our ideas are very consistent with work done by Cecilia Wong, Professor Cecilia Wong in Manchester. It also sits well with Nick Rainsford's report on planning for the TCPA. But we have gone further and set out a potential way forward. A national spatial plan for England should be prepared by a reconstituted National Planning and Infrastructure Commission, linked to the government's priorities and funding regimes, endorsed by Parliament, independently audited in a State of the Nation report, coordinated with the devolved administrations, integrated with subnational and departmental programmes, reviewed in line with parliamentary cycles, and be a material planning consideration. The national plan must be developed from the bottom up and not just imposed top down. It needs to be informed by, integrated with, and delivered through subnational strategies and devolved mechanisms. For me, this national plan should form part of a wider renaissance of spatial planning and urban development. In his final book, Good Cities, Better Lives, How Europe Discovered the Lost Art of Urbanism, Sir Peter Hall looked to our near neighbours in Europe to learn lessons about creating better places to live, work and play. It was published in 2014 at a time when local authority planning departments were suffering large cuts, often in the very capacity needed to deliver a creative planning process. It seems to me that at the heart of successful and sustainable European cities lies effective spatial planning and the powers and resources to see those plans through. Now, many of our inherited assumptions about transport, density, the role of town centres and home working will have to be rethought in the light of what we have learnt in responding to COVID-19. But the need for more effective spatial planning at all spatial levels remains as strong as ever. Above all, I want to see the planning profession as a creative profession, leading the work on spatial planning, not reduced to being a controlling profession focused only on development control. The current planning regime does need to move on from the over-engineered, under-resourced and litigious process that it has become. So reform is needed. But is the planning white paper the right answer? It's hard to argue with its aims. Who wouldn't want more beautiful developments on tree-lined streets, applauded by their local communities? The support for greater use of digital technology is welcome, as is the commitment to simplify the local plan process. But at the heart of the problem with the white paper is the belief that the planning process is the root cause of our failure to produce enough high-quality housing developments. This is despite copious evidence over many years, from the Lyons report to the Letwin report, that this is definitively not the case. As a consequence of this basic error, it proposes changes that, in my view, will have the opposite effect to that which the government intends. Let me just give you 3 examples of this. Firstly, the importance of genuinely affordable housing in boosting both supply and meeting an essential need is seriously underplayed. The proposal to move to a commuted sum rather than the negotiated provisions that we have at the moment risks reducing the level of affordable housing that is developed on sites. And that in turn risks the creation of monotenure estates. Replacing a negotiated sum with a fixed levy might look like simplification, but it will bring with it its own complexities and challenges. For example, getting the right level of levy in individual circumstances. Secondly, in my concerns, moving to a zonal, rules-based approach to planning approvals in growth areas rather than approving individual applications will drastically reduce local democratic engagement and potentially create greater rigidity. When individual schemes come forward, the public will not be happy to be told that their opportunity to comment and influence has already effectively passed. It will also reduce the scope for trade-offs that the current process allows. Alternately, we will end up with a zonal system that is honoured in the breach. My third concern is that an imposed top-down figure for increased housing numbers will take us right back to the divisive, self-defeating debates of a decade ago. Grant Shapps was my first housing minister, and he could not have been clearer in his opposition to top-down targets. A decade on, he forms part of a government that is going exactly in this direction. Moreover, Lichfields have calculated that the extra 100,000 homes proposed will involve 90% of them being in London and the South East, which doesn't sit at all well with the levelling up agenda. I've given just 3 examples here, but there are many more. Above all, anyone who thinks that this will reduce the current complex, contested and litigious nature of the planning process in the high demand areas outside London is sadly mistaken. It will just move the place where the battles take place. Someone once said to me that they didn't mind people making new mistakes. It was the repeating of old mistakes that they objected to. The planning white paper is at best a missed opportunity, at worst a serious retrograde step. But let me finish on a positive note. There is now a common recognition across the political parties in the UK that we will not flourish without addressing levelling up. So we agree on the ends, if not yet on the means. The title of the final UK 2070 report was Make No Little Plans. It comes from Daniel Burnham, who took a leading role in the master plans for the development of a number of American cities. I'd like to draw on this quote a bit more. Make no little plans. They have no magic to stir the blood, and probably themselves will not be realised. Make big plans. Aim high. Great ideas will never die, but live long with ever-growing urgency. If now is not the time for urgency and high ambition, then I'm not sure when it will be.
Thank you very much. That was Lord Kerslake, who will join us live from Sheffield after our next speaker. Our second speaker is no less distinguished. Baroness Brown of Cambridge is an engineer with a career spanning senior engineering and leadership roles in industry and academia. A crossbencher, she is the Deputy Chair of the Climate Change Committee, Chair of the Committee on Climate Change's Adaptation Committee, Non-Executive Director of the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult, and Chair of the Carbon Trust. She's also a member of the House of Lords European Union Select Committee. Her lecture is titled Planning for Climate Change. Baroness Brown.
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me to come and talk to you about this. This is something I'm very passionate about. This is called Planning for Climate Change. My message to you is very clear. We are not currently planning for climate change, and we need to be. It's perhaps surprising that we're not planning for climate change, since everybody seems to agree that it is the biggest global risk. This is the World Economic Forum Global Risk Landscape for 2020. Agreed it was done before the pandemic, but as you see, all of the top risks are climate related. Greater than pandemic, greater than financial failure, greater than cybercrime and cyber failure. All of those green diamonds up there are climate related. So we seem to recognize that this is the greatest global risk, but we don't seem to be doing very much about it. Well, in the UK, we have a process established in the Climate Change Act, whereby every 5 years the government presents to Parliament its climate change risk assessment. And our current UK climate change risk assessment is the one for 2017. The Committee on Climate Change, through the Adaptation Committee, we advise the government on this and we prepare the evidence base for it. But this is the list of risks that the government presented to Parliament in 2017 as our current highest risks from climate change. There are 6 of them, but the top 3 are particularly significant in the context of planning. Flooding and coastal change, risks to health, particularly from high temperatures, and shortage of water. Flooding. Well, a real big problem with flooding is sea level rise. The science tells us that it is perfectly plausible that by the end of the century there will be 2 meters of sea level rise. If we have 2 meters of sea level rise and a 1 in 200 year tidal surge, then some areas of the UK become inundated with water, but actually almost all of our flood defences in the southeast of England and right up to the Midlands, almost all of those would be at risk. That has very significant implications if you're planning to do something near the coast. Of course, flooding isn't only about the coast. We also get river flooding, we get surface water flooding, we get groundwater flooding. At the moment, we have around 1.8 million people who live in areas of significant flood risk. By the 2050s, even if we're on that 1.5 to 2 degree temperature path that was agreed at Paris, that will go up to something like 2.6 million. And that doesn't take into account the fact that actually the climate is changing such that we're seeing more periods of short but very intense rainfall, which cause surface water flooding, a particular problem in the middles of our cities, and particularly those still working on their Victorian sewers. But of course, flooding doesn't just affect houses, it affects all of our infrastructure. So we already have up in Scotland and around the north some areas where we have quite a significant amount of road and rail that can be affected by flooding. On a 2 degree path by the 2050s, that's increasing by several percent. If we're on a 4 degree path, that could be 40 to 60% worse in many of those areas. Temperature. The Ministry of Housing, MHCLG, I can never remember the acronym. The MHCLG's own data says that all new homes in the UK are likely to overheat in a typical summer. Now, we've just experienced in 2018 and 2019 2 summers which are currently quite atypical. By 2050, those will be typical summers. There is a 50% chance that every summer will be like the summer of 2018. So if they overheat in a typical summer, we'll all be boiling by the middle of the century. These are 3 projections that show for the middle of the century the kind of range of temperature rise we can expect to see, even if we're on that 2 degree path that we'd like to be on. So they range between a 2 to 3 degree increase right up to a 6 to 7 degree increase. And what that tells us is that we can't just plan for the center of the distribution, because actually there's a 10% chance that by mid-century, down in the southeast, it could on average be 7 degrees hotter. Drought. We don't hear very much about drought in this country, but this is a projection that if we're on the path that we're probably globally on at the moment, which is of a 3.5 degree rise by the end of the century. If we're on that path, even if we do lots of adaptation and we don't have too much population growth in this country, parts of the country will be desperately short of water. So in Cambridge and the Fens, where we grow a lot of our food, there will be demand will exceed supply by over 200%. And actually in parts of the West, if we provide water for the needs of the natural environment, there will be no water left for humans. Now, I'm sure that's a situation we wouldn't allow to arise, but that's the kind of situation we could be in, and we need to recognise that in our planning. So what do we need to do? Well, there are two things we clearly need to do. We need to reduce our emissions, and we've set our net zero target, and it's critical that we get the policies in place to deliver it. And we can see from this chart, the top line that starts to come down very steeply is power. We're starting to decarbonise our electricity system quite effectively. But the two lines that now are the next two highest contributions to climate change emissions are buildings and transport. And as Bob has just mentioned, those are two really key areas from a planning perspective. So planning needs to be contributing to helping us stopping those curves being flat and getting them to be turning down very, very sharply to get down to zero by 2050. The other thing we need to do is adapt. If we look at the first grey bar on this chart, that's present day, the cost of present day annual damage from flooding. If we look at the very tall red bar, or reddish-orange bar, that's if we get to the 2080s and we haven't got onto that 1.5 degree path and we haven't done much adaptation, that's the kind of flood damaging, a double of annual flood damages. And then the final bar, the brown one, that's 2080 if we're on that 1.5 to 2 degree path and we've done all the things we can do in adaptation. So we can keep flood damages, even in that scenario, down to somewhere near where they are today, but only if we act. So the first thing we need to act on is our buildings, and Bob has touched a little bit on this. We need to deliver those zero emission buildings to get down to net zero, but we also need to be thinking about flood resilience. Those property level measures like raising the ground floor, raised electrics, making sure ground floors are concrete. We need to make sure we have sustainable drainage systems to help us cope with those periods of very, very intense rainfall. So things like green roofs, but actually green space and porous paving. If we're making our buildings well sealed to reduce heat loss, we've got to remember that they've still got to be well ventilated to give good air quality to the inhabitants, and we've got to protect them from overheating as our temperatures continue to rise. They've got to be water efficient. We need to be thinking about the external space. And we need something that we are severely lacking at the moment, which is compliance and enforcement to make sure what is required is actually being done. In terms of development, there are three areas I'd like to flag up of significant concern. One of those is permitted development and the quality of particularly homes that is leading to. The second is continued development in floodplains and the increasing risk and the increasing cost that will give us for the future. And the third is one that we hear very little about, which is development in water-stressed areas. So here's an example of a permitted development, an office block which has been turned into flats. Okay, it looks quite nice from the outside, but on a sunny day in September 2018, in those flats that didn't have their blinds down, temperatures rose to 47.5 degrees. That's not a home, that's uninhabitable. Development on floodplains. This map shows the development that has gone on in floodplains over the last 5 to 10 years. We know flooding risks are rising. We can see now there are many areas of England where over 25% of new development has been in floodplains. And there are one or two places I need to apologise to here. One of them is Hull, where they have very little land area to develop on that doesn't sit on a floodplain. So if you're going to develop in Hull, you haven't got any choice. But this is only going to get worse. The flood risk now is much less, as I've shown you, than it will be by 2050 or 2080. And finally, the one we don't hear very much about is development in water-stressed areas. Now, there's a huge demand for, as Bob has highlighted to us, for development around the southeast. One of those areas is the Oxford, Cambridge, Milton Keynes arc. And that's roughly marked in that white oval on the map. And you can see that that's in an area of particular water stress, where demand will exceed supply potentially by 200%. So if we have to develop in these places, and Bob has given some very good reasons why maybe we don't have to develop in these places, but if we have to develop in these places, then the local authorities in those areas need to be able to demand very, very high water efficiency standards from those developments. And then let me get on to just mentioning some planning issues in terms of urban design that are important. Bob has already mentioned the importance of travel and transport and public transport. That has a huge impact on our CO2 emissions, and that has to be really top of the agenda in terms of how do we reduce emissions. But from an adaptation point of view, green space is absolutely critical. We need much more porous surface, particularly in our towns and cities, where water can soak away. And green space is ideal for doing this. And yet, the proportion of green space and the proportion of permeable urban area has been consistently decreasing. Even though we know it's essential, it should be increasing. But green space, of course, also provides shading, reduces urban heat island effect, and also with trees provides emissions reduction, and of course, great places for us to exercise, and we all know the well-being that comes from seeing greenery and trees. So green space is a win-win-win benefit, and yet it's declining in our urban areas. Now, we're hoping that we will only need to plan for 1.5 degrees of warming, but unfortunately, that isn't really where we are. So if we look at the targets and pledges currently from the Paris Agreement, that takes us to a global temperature increase of between 2 and 3.5 degrees. Current policies takes us from somewhere between 2 and 4 degrees, and if we're more optimistic, maybe 2 to 3.5. But we really do need to plan on the assumption that warming could be occurring at a range between about 2 and 4 degrees. We don't want it, but we need to be planning for it because it could happen. And one of the ways we can do that is using the adaptive pathways approach. That's the way we are using, the Environment Agency is using for looking at the Thames estuary and flooding in the Thames estuary. So we have the existing Thames barrier. We want really that to last for as long as possible, but at some point we will have to make a decision about whether we need a new Thames barrage. Basically, adaptation pathways is about saying, what are the absolutely no-brainer things we can be getting on with now that still leave us the option, if it turns out we're on this 4-degree pathway, that still leaves us the option to cost-effectively do the much bigger things later on. And we need to be using much more of this thinking in our planning of major infrastructure. So like Bob, I just want to finish by touching on the Planning for the Future white paper from a climate change perspective. And it's good in the consultation to see the recognition of the need for particularly climate change mitigation, but even adaptation gets a mention. Although it's absolutely clear that adaptation to the changing climate is not really very deeply thought about or embedded, in my view, in this white paper. So it's good to see that it's recognised, but of course what is we won't know until we see the detail is how extensive or how this need for mitigation and adaptation is going to be achieved. So whereas targeted spatial areas might work for mitigation, it's not clear that they're going to work for adaptation. National model design codes and an oversight body well, this could be positive, but the design codes must address achieving net zero and all of the adaptation issues. So the flooding, the water requirements, the overheating, they all need to be there. A single sustainable development test for all environmental criteria. Well, whilst that sounds appealing in terms of making things much simpler, in terms of the complex set of requirements for achieving net zero and for adapting to the changing climate, maybe that's going to be too simplistic. A real concern, of course, of overextension of permitted development rights. Good to hear areas of flood risk will be excluded from growth areas, but we need to know what level of flood risk and what about areas of water stress. Are we going to think about excluding those as well? And great to hear that there is an intention to strengthen enforcement powers and sanctions. That's absolutely crucial, but there's little detail. So I think, you know, an indication this may be an opportunity to do some things better, but the devil will be in the detail. Until we understand what that looks like, I think I remain concerned that we aren't planning for climate change. And here's an example of sometimes we don't. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that very thought-provoking presentation, Baroness Brown. Now, I am delighted to say that we are joined live from Sheffield by Lord Kerslake, who will also be joining in our question and answer session. I just want to indicate to all the delegates who are following us online, you have now access to the function for Q&A, so please use it, ask lots of questions. We have just over 20 minutes to get as many questions as possible to get through this afternoon following those two very distinguished lectures that we have just heard. I'll come straight to Lord Kerslake to begin with, following your presentation. If you can hear me just as well over there. Good afternoon.
Thank you.
Lord Kerslake, one of the things that you picked up on about the white paper that I just wanted to explore a bit more was the question of affordable housing. And that, of course, goes into the question of levelling up agenda that we're told is the future for the country. Affordable housing, one of the key changes that is being proposed is this sort of move away from the negotiated idea to the fixed one. Could you just elaborate a bit more about your concerns in relation to that, how we need to make sure that through this consultation we get that right, and what your suggestions might be for following that up through the white paper and through the legislation as it makes its way through the Commons and the Lords?
Yeah, sure. I'll say a few things about that. I mean, I think the first point to make is that our ability to deliver affordable housing isn't simply about the planning process. The planning process is one enabler of affordable housing, but it's not, in many ways, the biggest. And actually what we need is a significant government-funded affordable housing programme. The government have increased the amount they're putting in, but at the moment, I'm not sure the model will work to deliver what we need. So that's the first point to make. The second point to make here is that I think a big part of our challenge on housing comes from the unequal growth that we've seen in this country, as I think, by the way, are some of our environmental challenges, and I touched on that earlier. So we certainly do need to focus on more housing in the south, because that's where the issues are. But unless we address the levelling up agenda, we'll simply come back round the problem again at greater cost. So those are two big kind of context points. But it's specifically in terms of the white paper, my concern is this really. I think it's not given adequate prominence in the white paper in terms of what we have to achieve in terms of affordable housing. It was much more strongly expressed in the previous housing white paper done on fixing the broken market. My worry about the levy is A, the fixed nature of it will mean that it's right for some developments and not necessarily right for others. And B, that even though the white paper talks about still being able to require development on site, I think we will inexorably move towards a levy as the method of dealing with planning gain, rather than the creation of genuinely mixed developments. And I think that would be a serious retrograde step. look, nobody would say that the 106 process doesn't have its challenges, but I worry that people think that this will magically address some of those complexities when actually I think it could make things potentially more difficult and avoid and reduce the ability to maximise the affordable housing on schemes.
Thank you. And to Baroness Brown, can I just pick up one of the things you raised, which is about the consequence of permitted development rights. This very month, there are new proposals that have just come into force that make it much easier to essentially make better benefit of permitted development rights. One of the ones you picked up on was this office to residential building that meant that actually much of the climate change aspects were not taken into consideration. And so in some ways, if I may read your lecture, is you're saying that actually in some ways the permitted development rights that are being loosened should have more consideration rather than less in relation to climate change. So how do we then square that circle of the government trying to liberalise permitted development more, and you're saying that actually one of the difficulties that we're faced with is those kind of unintended consequences?
I think it's very challenging. I mean, that's not my area of expertise, is not, I think, how we might do it, but what we need to do. And we have to be, when we are building or converting things into homes, we have to be making sure that these are homes that are going to move us along on the path to achieving net zero, whilst also ensuring that the conditions for the people who live in them are, that they're fit for purpose in a world where the climate is changing. And just to convert an office into flats without taking into account those considerations, without providing something like mechanical shuttering on the outside to help keep the sun out, it is not adequate. So it seems to me if you're going to give people permitted development, there needs to be a set of standards or something against which they have to do that for the quality of the experience for the inhabitants.
And Lord Curzay, one of the things you touched upon in your lecture was about the sort of top-down numbers on housing need and how we might achieve those aspects of it. I don't know if you've seen one of the things that happened a few days ago was a minister that came forward that sort of said, well, actually, let me address one of the myths of what the white paper seeks to achieve. We do not want to take away the opportunities for local decision-making, and he was talking about the potential of some of these proposals being exempted of certain areas, London being one of them. What do you make of this sort of conversations that we're happening now, where on the one hand we're being told that there's going to be this top-down agenda that's going to resolve all the issues of the housing crisis, and yet at the same time through the Localism Act and other conversations we're telling local people that it's a decision for you?
Well, they don't add up, do they, really, these two ways of looking at the issue? That's the problem with it. And it's hard to imagine how you can say that some parts of the country are going to be exempt from the imposition of top-down targets because it's seen as contentious and difficult, and in other parts of the country they're going to be imposed. It's not a coherent or consistent system, is it really? And I was sort of actively involved in government when they moved away from those targets, and the problem in a sense is unless there's some local engagement in the development of the targets, a debate, and only imposition really where you fail to be able to find a sensible resolution to this, can you get the ownership you need? I think what it inexorably leads to is diminished local ability to control things. And I just think it's not going to work, is my basic concern about it. I mean, we've had experience recently of algorithms that have struggled. Let's be very careful not to do it again. Just quickly on permitted development rights, and I'm glad that it was raised, actually, because permitted development rights were introduced, or the widening of them was introduced, at a time of the economy being in real trouble. It was a counter-cyclical measure to get the economy going. But it's ended up being a permanent measure and being now proposed to be expanded. It has two real problems, actually. One is you end up with often very much poorer designed schemes, exactly as has been said earlier. And secondly, actually, it removes the affordable housing dimension here. So I think I understand the temptation of doing it, because it's perceived to produce more housing. We never know what the counterfactual is on that, but I think it's very problematic in terms of the quantity schemes. And by the way, often developers are some of the people most unhappy about permitted development rights.
Yes, thank you. And just touching upon some of the points you made, Baroness Brown, in relation to the white paper recognising the question of adapting to an ever-changing climate. In terms of then just thinking through, you've said in your lecture that it doesn't look like it's been deeply considered or properly considered in that aspect. I mean, if you were to sit down right now and propose one key idea into these reforms for how we might adapt better, what would you say that would be?
I actually think that giving more power, putting more power, as Bob has said, back locally is crucial, because actually adaptation issues tend to be very local. Areas know whether they are water stressed. Areas know whether they are in particular flood risk zones. So not imposing things centrally, but actually letting, particularly these sort of metro mayors, these combined authorities, letting them actually look at their local conditions and think about how they can, which areas they can safely developing and the type of development that will be suitable, and giving them powers over the standards of building that are needed.
But will that always work though? Because if you do a planning inquiry anywhere in the country, you'll come across a lot of local people who might turn up with pictures of flooding that took place many years ago, or concerns about flooding that inevitably might actually mean that development is going to be stopped altogether. I mean, you gave the example of Hull, where they're never going to be able to avoid some sort of flooding. How do you reconcile that then, the need for development, the need for housing, for example, and the need to protect ourselves, and the fact that there's always going to be that tension? And if you just say that it's always going to be one where we have to leave it to the local decision making, it may mean that actually there's going to be some sort of blockage there. I mean, how do we reconcile that?
Well, I think one of the things that we don't require is flood resilience measures in homes. Maybe it is, I'm just speculating here, but maybe it is, there are areas where we should be building houses with significantly raised ground floors, where the underneath part is just used for parking and it's not used for any kind of human habitation. Maybe there are quite a lot of property level flood resilience measures for low risk flooding that can be very helpful in making sure people can be got back into their homes very quickly after a flood, because we know that the mental health consequences of flooding are very significantly associated with how long it takes to refurbish people's homes, how long it is before they can get back in, and indeed, of course, how many of their very personal belongings get destroyed. So, we can do different types of development, different types of building. We can put different measures in, and of course, if we have areas where there are very significant assets, then those will be areas where we may be looking to make significantly increased investments in flood defences.
Lord Kerslake, one of the questions we've had come in digitally is actually quite pertinent for you as the president of the Local Government Association before, and it's asking for your reflections on how you see the white paper's ideas fit into proposals for local government reform. I think one of the things you touched upon was about how under-resourced our system is locally, for example, and we know how much the cuts of 2010 onwards have impacted planning offices, for example. I mean, I don't know what your reflections are on the white paper and the sort of local government reforms potentially having to go in tandem.
Yes, it's very interesting, and this is going to be a kind of critical period for local government. We've got the white paper, we've got a devolution white paper coming, which will contain within it, we understand, proposals for fairly radical change in the structure of local government. And of course, we're still awaiting the social care white paper, which is relevant to this debate, because that's about resources as well. A few points on this, really. I personally believe that we should move to single-tier local government in those areas where we have two-tier local government. But it will be very, very strongly contested, and actually contested. This is going to be a contest as much as anything within the Conservative Party as anything else, because it's those councils where the impact's going to be felt. So stand by for quite a heated debate about local government reorganisation. But personally, I've worked in unitary councils and I've worked with two-tier, and it would be much better if it's moved towards a single tier over time. It's got to be done with the collaboration of local government, though. I think the second point I'd make is I think there will be real concern about the planning white paper proposals in terms of the loss of local democracy and decision-making on individual schemes. And that will be manifest, I think, through representations on the white paper. And there's time to change it. That's the important point. I think I very much take that point. I think the third point, though, we shouldn't lose sight of is that the planning resource has been severely cut back because of the loss of resources in local government. And I think, personally, a critical part of the white paper needs to be about a programme of growing the resources and the capability of planning teams across the country. If you don't do that, then in a sense you're going to really struggle to improve how things are done. Local government's lost around a quarter or a bit more actually of its budgets since 2010, and every bit of them has felt that because they've had to protect social care. And unless we restore the status and the funding of planning departments, I don't think we'll make progress in the way we need to.
Yeah, and Baroness Brown, the question of collaboration, which I think what Lord Kerslake was touching upon there, is quite important on the climate change agenda, especially across borders and across different countries. We've seen what's been happening on the west coast of the United States with the fires that are taking place at the moment. You have a role in the House of Lords European Union Select Committee. We've seen what's happened recently in the last few days in relation to the withdrawal agreement. How would you reflect on the need for us to adapt, collaborate, do more nationally and internationally, and the world that we're now moving towards with the sort of uncertainty that we're seeing with us leaving the European Union, and how that might change in the next sort of years to come?
I think this what I see as a bit of a tendency to nationalism globally is very concerning in the context of climate change, in the context of the up and coming COP. I mean, it's in all our interests, as you can see, to work together on the climate change agenda. The consequences for the UK are not as bad for many of the southern hemisphere countries, but actually the picture of the UK in a 4-degree world is a very frightening place for people's children to be living in. So we do need to be collaborating strongly, and actually we need to be collaborating on adaptation. Our food supply chains are now global. If we want to continue to have coffee and tea, we need to make sure that those countries growing it and the people picking it are able to do that in bearable conditions. So we're hugely interreliant, and adaptation globally is important. And actually DFID, and now hopefully DFID moved into the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, has an outstanding reputation internationally for the work it does in supporting adaptation internationally.
And Lord Kerslake, just in terms of what you were talking about, the missed opportunities and how we need to do more, one of the things I've always thought about in terms of affordable housing, as we started upon, is about whether or not we need to have more bigger ideas. And I just wanted to reflect a bit more about that. Do you think, for example, we need to be having more conversations about resources for local authorities to start building houses themselves? The sort of maybe potentially talking about capital gains tax, which was mentioned by one of the questions in online, whether we need to be really much more radical if we are going to make headway in these things, and quite frankly, whether any of those proposals are going to be politically palatable. And I'll throw in 2 words with that: Greenbelt.
Yes, that's a big question you've just asked there, and I'll try and disentangle the bits of it. What I yearn for is an ability for local authorities to be able to do the spatial planning with the capacity and the capabilities they need to address all of the issues that are involved, environmental in particular, but beyond that, so that they can take a genuinely kind of comprehensive approach to the development of places. That seems to me to be core to really what we're arguing in our UK 2070 report, actually, as I talked about, a renaissance of genuine comprehensive spatial planning. And some are moving in that direction. I think Greater Manchester have done some really interesting work. But we can end up being reduced to a fight about numbers rather than these much more fundamental issues, I think. The second point I'm making on affordable housing, you're absolutely right. We need a bigger ambition and a bigger sense of the funding required. If you go back to when we produced more than 300,000 homes in 1966, and UK, when England won the World Cup, you will see that it wasn't just about more private housing, it was about a big public housing programme at the same time. Frankly, I don't care whether it's housing associations or local authorities. I'd like them both to be playing big roles in developing new housing. And I guess my last point is, yes, this will all have resource consequences, as will, properly responding to climate change will have big resource consequences. But the consequences we don't address them are much, much bigger. And by the way, we talk about new homes, and that's absolutely right. You talked about that. The big challenge on housing is existing stock, for which we truly, at the moment, don't have a proper plan.
Baroness Brown, I see you nodding there. Do you want to just respond to that point there?
Well, just if we look at the, whatever it is, 30 million buildings we have already, that many of which will still be with us in 2050, that's far more than the new builds that we have. So the challenge of converting them to be both net zero, but also to be habitable in the changing climate is a huge one. Doesn't get anything like enough attention.
Yeah. And just and then thinking about some of the stuff that you've been saying, I mean, what are your reflections of the last sort of 6 months that we've had, and do you see some potential there in terms of behavioural changes? I mean, I'm not convinced at all, this idea that we're all going to work from home in the future and we're all going to abandon the offices and all the rest of it. But in terms of helping societies mentally, conceptually adapt to a changing world, how have you seen the last few months as potentially being an opportunity to move people to think differently about their climate?
Well, I think working from home is something that we do need to try and capture. Clearly not at the level that we're doing it at the moment, but I think we have demonstrated to many companies and to many people that for some jobs it's perfectly feasible, and we could significantly reduce commuting. We do need to capture some of that. The NHS is a huge creator of emissions, and we've shown some things like, for some types of appointment with your GP, people have found online to be very satisfactory. So I think there are bits that we do very much want to capture. We've also seen something like a 250% increase in cycling, which is good for emissions. It's good for our health. I think we need to be driving forward to try and see how we can capture that. But disappointingly, having seen a 31% reduction, maximum reduction in our emissions in March and in April, May, half of that was from surface transport, and we've now seen essentially all of those surface transport emissions reappear. And I think there's a real fear that there will be a rebound where surface transport emissions actually get even bigger because people are now so concerned about public transport. So we really do need to find ways to demonstrate to the public that we can make public transport safe again.
Thank you. And Lord Kerslake, can I just ask you to just reflect a bit more on the point you were making about spatial planning for England? I know that a lot of people talk about the sort of German model. We know that the East and West unification, but of course we have a North and South divide in that sense with resources, differences, the country kind of split down various lines. But when you talk about spatial planning, you recall we had the regional strategies which were then abolished. We're now dealing with the sort of national planning policy framework that is going through a reform. I mean, is there any chance for England to ever settle this question if every few years we're introducing something completely new and different that kind of is either retrograde or we've tried before and has failed and so on and so forth? I mean, it just seems as though we're never able to settle on something that will stick for a long time, and whatever we find doesn't last long enough.
No, you're right to point to the way we've chopped and changed over the years, often with the political cycle. So we had regional development agencies, they've gone. We've had different funding regimes, they've changed. As you say, we've had different planning regimes and they've changed. And we definitely need to try and get longer term thinking that goes across political cycles. It's one of the reasons why we suggested that this plan might be developed by a recast infrastructure committee, if you like, the infrastructure to bring planning into it, really, into the commission. And what we think is that having a national plan wouldn't be a kind of very detailed directive. You have to do X in Bolton and Y in Sheffield, but it would set the context for the plans in those areas and the creation of regional plans. And it is an interesting question why we have, Scotland's on its third spatial plan now, guiding its development as a place, giving a spatial dimension to its economic development. And we've not got anything in England really, and I think it would provide a long-term context, but you need structures that can work across political boundaries, and I think that's one of the things we've given a lot of thought to in our report. And I think ultimately it would help us take the big decisions on infrastructure and reconcile these competing issues around environment and growth and so on in a much more effective way than we do at the moment. So yes, it's a challenge, I agree with you. And you might say, we're just too contested to ever make it work. But I honestly think we can try. And the work that's been done on infrastructure, I think, is an example of long-term thinking that has managed to continue through different elections and different cycles.
And the other side of the coin about Baroness Brown, you were talking in relation to not just the question of flooding, but there's also that serious question about drought and how that is going to be a major issue. Could you just tell us a little bit more about the challenges that we're going to face in relation to that, and how the planning system in particular might assist in responding to that in the near and distant future?
Well, the water supply issues are quite different for different parts of the country. It is quite a local issue. So in one sense, the planning system can help in terms of taking it into account. But also, at the moment, for example, our average household water consumption is about 140 litres per person per day. If we can get that down to somewhere closer to 90, and we can deal with leaks, and we can deal with similar levels of reductions in industrial water efficiency, water use, actually that plot of what the country looks like in 2050 and 2080 in terms of water shortages looks very different. So, crucially, we need to be thinking about the water consumption in these homes, the appliances, the fittings they have in them, and we need that to be part of our building standards. And I've said, if local areas were able to decide that they needed even higher standards of water efficiency, that would help if we really need to do that development in those places for a range of other reasons. And I would say that other places in Europe already achieve 90 litres per person per day, so it's not rocket science.
Yes. Last couple of questions coming through online. Lord Kerslake, do you think there is somebody asks, do you think there is any political appetite to implement the recommendations of the UK 2070 Commission?
Yes, I do actually. We've had good discussions with officials and indeed with politicians about what we're trying to achieve here. Will it all happen in the way we say? Probably not. I'm not that optimistic. But I think the government understands that it needs a plan on levelling up. It sets some expectations as to what can happen here. And at the moment, they don't have anything close to a plan to enable it to be delivered. And I think we have given them, through our report, some potential ways in which they could actually secure the outcome they're looking for. So I do feel optimistic that we can make progress here. If there's a genuine desire to see levelling up happen and be a reality.
And, Baroness Brown, can I ask for your thoughts on this levelling up agenda? I mean, some might argue that sometimes there is a tension between this levelling up agenda that seeks to build more houses, give people more an opportunity to get on the property ladder, give more people more opportunities to be able to better their lives wherever they are, and the need to make sure that we are not having a complete disregard for our environment. Do you see any tension in that? Is there a contradiction in term there?
I think there are some tensions, but actually if you look at what we need to do in this country to meet net zero, the way we need to be developing our energy system, the way we need to be developing offshore wind, the way we need to be developing industrial clusters to do things like produce hydrogen, there is an enormous potential for contributing to the levelling up agenda, because the kind of places that we need to develop to do these things are places like Hull and Grimsby. Many of them are around the coast in depressed coastal areas, particularly for the offshore wind and the renewable energy system. Many of them are in the old sort of manufacturing hotspots around the northeast and the northwest. So the opportunity for recreating industry in those places, and therefore the housing that needs to go with that, I think is huge with the net zero agenda.
Can I ask then, just as a final thought from both of you, reflecting on both the white paper, the levelling up agenda, the role of the planning system, climate change, and how all of these are the real challenges of our future. Lord Kerslake, do you know whether England is the only nation in northwestern Europe that actually doesn't have a regional spatial planning of any sort, or are we unique in that sense? Or do you know whether there are other countries that are doing this similar to us? And finally, what would you say is the number one thing that should come out of this white paper if we're going to make headway with this sort of reform that is supposed to be the reform that's going to change how we see each other as a nation together?
I don't know if we're unique on this in terms of the lack of a national plan in England and indeed the lack of regional plans, but I think we're pretty unique. Most European countries have got such plans. It's also worth saying that not only are we one of the most unequal countries, we're also one of the most centralised as well. So devolving power has to be a critical part of the change really here. And I do think there's actually a growing consensus about quite a lot of that in terms of the way forward. And what was your second point?
The second one was just about what your main reform would be to come out of the white paper.
As I said, there are some things in the white paper that are welcome. I think actually the investment in digital is welcome, but I think if it does nothing else, and I hope some of the less attractive aspects of it go, simplifying the local plan process is crucially important because at the moment it's a laborious process that some councils never get to the end of really. So I would put that as the thing I'd really like to hang on to in the white paper. If we could complement that with a proper debate about resourcing and the role of genuine spatial planning, that would be a very positive outcome.
Baroness Brown, your own reflections of how you hope these reforms that are taking place from your perspective could make all the difference, and what would your desirable, number one, most likely reform that you would like to see?
Well, to make sure that planning takes account of climate change, the need to reach net zero, and the need for the building and the planning we do to be successful in a changed climate in the future.
Thank you very much for that. Can I just thank our two very distinguished speakers who are joining us today, both Lord Kerslake joining us from Sheffield and Baroness Brown right here with me in London. That completes the first part of not the Oxford Planning Conference 2020. We have adapted to where things are at the moment, and we will move on to the second part in just a moment. So thank you very much, Baroness Brown. Thank you very much, Lord Kerslake. We have coming up for you the legal update, which is the second part of the conference this afternoon, which is going to be presented by Jonathan Easton of King's Chambers, and he will be joined by Mary Cook of Town Legal in just a moment. So stay with us, and they will join you in just a few moments.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Jonathan Easton, who was called to the bar in 1996, having obtained a first-class law degree and an LLM in comparative and international law. Not only is he a first-class lawyer, he excels in all forms of communication, as you are about to witness, is very personable and great fun to be with, although I know that his children worry that he's addicted to work and his telephone in particular. Now, normally I would be doing this introduction at Oxford on a Sunday morning after a hectic Saturday full of lectures, eating and drinking, and for me personally, disco dancing into the small hours of the morning, something I always look forward to at the Oxford conference. And I would be congratulating you all on your stamina. Today may be different, but this year's legal update will, I'm sure, be as keenly anticipated as always. So without further ado, I hand you over to Jonathan. Enjoy.
Thank you, Mary. Well, that recollection of disco dancing calls to mind one of the clearest memories I've had of past Oxford planning conferences, that of my learned and esteemed co-host, Mary Cook, dancing in the small hours with the late, great and sadly missed Andrew Gilbart, then Mr. Justice Gilbart. Very, very clear memories indeed. So today's event for me is one of firsts. It's the first time I've worn long trousers since March. It's the first time that I have presented anything from the set of Dragon's Den. And most importantly, it's the first time I've been asked, with great and humble respect, to be asked to provide the legal update at this esteemed conference. So I've written a paper for the Journal of Planning and Environmental Law, and for those of you youngsters amongst you, it's going to drop in October. Due to various publication and editing deadlines, the period of time that I've looked at in the paper is September 2019 to July 2020. And so that I don't spoil the plot, as it were, I'm going to pick out some of the key themes that emerged during that particular legal year. Then I'm going to provide an update to the update and mention one or two cases that have been handed down since July. Following that, I'm going to use a real crystal ball to predict some of the themes and trends that are going to come as I see them over the next 12 months or so. So planning is multifaceted, as everyone knows. It's a fantastic subject. It impacts on all our daily lives and is often fabulously quirky, as this slide demonstrates. So this year's legal cases have involved some 18th century urns, a litigious brewery, a donut, more of that later, some Lego, and a miniature railway. And planning is also very topical. You will have seen even some of the red top newspapers over the last month in particular have given planning a very strong coverage. Statistics. Now, we've all become amateur statisticians during lockdown, some of us more amateur than others. So I'm going to keep the statistical analysis to a level commensurate with my statistical ability. Now, since the Planning Court's establishment, there have been over 377 Planning Court judgments. There have been over 105 planning-related cases handed down by the Court of Appeal and 11 by the Supreme Court. I should say at this stage that these data that I have obtained from the recently launched and excellent Planning Court Case Explorer, which is the responsibility of Mary's firm, Town Legal. So, given the many thousands of decisions taken by government, inspectors and local planning authorities during this period, many of them extremely contentious, the number of cases that have gone the jurisprudential distance seem particularly small. And I ask rhetorically, is this an indication of a system that works pretty well most of the time? One of the reasons it does potentially work pretty well is the Planning Court's panel of expert judges, familiar with the relevant legal concepts, and able to drill down into the key issues, often with an unnerving and laser-like focus, has produced a fairly efficient system of planning judicial review. So in that context, and topically, if I may say so, the recently formed government panel on judicial review may be able to learn a lot from the way in which the planning court operates and how it sets clear but appropriately flexible boundaries between policy making and executive decision making and judicial intervention, and how it sieves out unmeritorious cases. In fact, as a number of judgments have illustrated, especially in the realm of policy interpretation, what the policymaker thinks they were saying and what the words actually mean are sometimes two very different things. With the planning for the future white paper making promises about tightly defining expressions such as substantial development, I foresee that the court's interpretive and supervisory function is likely to become more, not less important in the coming years. So I turn next to some judicial trends. Well, personally speaking, I don't know about everyone else, when it comes to judicial trends, I look no further than the Honourable Judge Rinder for my inspiration. Now, it might be a fool's errand, frankly, to search for jurisprudential themes or trends, and I appreciate that such an exercise is necessarily a subjective one. Nevertheless, I've given it a go, and I've tried to identify some patterns in judicial decision-taking over the last year. The first of which is challenging, or perhaps you could put it, shifting the orthodox approach. So a number of decisions this year have examined and in some cases shifted legal concepts whose roots are deeply embedded, or were deeply embedded, in the planning system and have been for some time. Perhaps the best illustration of this trend was the Sam Smiths against North Yorkshire County Council case handed down by the Supreme Court in early February this year, early February being precisely 18 years ago in COVID time. This case concerned a judicial review to the grant of planning permission for an extension to Jackdaw Quarry. Jackdaw Quarry is a limestone quarry, some 1.5 kilometres from Sam Smith's brewery in Tadcaster. The site's in the Greenbelt, and in an extremely long and detailed report, the County Council considered the likely visual impact on landscape, but did not expressly address the visual dimension of openness when considering Greenbelt harm, relying instead on the traditional view that openness is a spatial concept. Now, older planners, and I may or may not include myself in that bracket, may harbour a degree of nostalgia for simpler days when the concept of Greenbelt openness was uncomplicated. Openness simply meant the absence of development. There's no need to get involved with more elusive and subjective concepts like visual amenity. And if I may say so, they were happier days. The cracks in the old orthodoxy started showing in Turner against the Secretary of State, a Court of Appeal case from 2016, when Lord Justice Sales, as he then was, interpreted the concept of openness as one which was, I quote, open-textured with a number of different factors capable of being relevant when it comes to applying it to the particular facts of a case. Now, in the Sam Smith's case, went to the Court of Appeal, Lord Justice Lindblom quashed the planning permission, holding that under the National Planning Policy Framework, visual impact was a potentially relevant and potentially significant factor when addressing openness of the Greenbelt, and it was something that had to be taken into account, which the County Council had not done. Now, the planners with rose-tinted spectacles could breathe at least a hesitant sigh of relief upon reading the Supreme Court's judgment, for it re-established, albeit only to some extent, the old orthodoxy. So a number of key points to draw out of the Supreme Court's judgment. Openness is a broad policy concept that is not necessarily linked to visual amenity. Some forms of development, such as mineral extraction, may not, in principle, be incompatible with openness. To illustrate this point, Lord Carnwath commented, as a barrier to urban sprawl, a quarry may be regarded in Greenbelt policy terms as no less effective than a stretch of agricultural land. So if there are any mineral planners tuned in, what you need to do is get that on a bumper sticker, because that's going to be really helpful for you. The second point was NPPF paragraph 90, now paragraph 146, doesn't expressly or by implication refer to visual openness. those matters which are relevant to the openness assessment are a matter of planning judgment. So the orthodox view that openness equals absence of development was not resurrected entirely, but in passing, the Supreme Court did observe that that approach was more consistent with a framework which draws a distinction between urban sprawl and openness. So the consequences of the Supreme Court judgment when it comes to greenbelt policy means that the scope for challenging greenbelt decisions relating to openness is now considerably narrower, with the broad question of openness being within the ambit of planning judgment. In this regard, the judgment of the Supreme Court continues another theme of recent cases in which a sharp distinction is drawn between the interpretation of policies, which is a matter for the courts, and their application, the latter being only subject to irrationality. Now, the significance, in my view, of the Sam Smith judgment is much wider than settling the Greenbelt openness debate. The brewery's argument in its challenge was, in effect, that the council have failed to take into account a material consideration, that being the visual impact of the development on openness. In this context, however, Lord Carnwath endorsed the reasoning in the Derbyshire Dales case and the Antipodean case of Creed NZ against the Governor-General. And in summary, the legal question, said the Supreme Court, when it comes to material considerations, was whether visual impacts were expressly or impliedly identified in the Act or the policy in question as matters that must be taken into account as a legal obligation, or, on the facts of the case, they were so obviously material as to require direct consideration. That, in my view, is a major shift. And that major shift was taken up in the next case that I'm going to talk about, which is the fairly recent Client Earth challenge, a challenge to a development consent order approving 2 gas-fired generating units at the Drax facility. There are 2 paragraphs in the Client Earth judgment following the analysis of the Supreme Court in Sam Smith's, which I think should be pasted into every planning lawyer's notebook, paragraphs 99 and 100. And I've got a business idea here. Perhaps what we could do is we could print some T-shirts, paragraph 99 on the front, paragraph 100 on the back, and then the position will be very clear. In summary, those 2 paragraphs indicate that it will no longer be possible for a claimant simply to assert that a decision maker hasn't taken into account a material consideration. So that was part of the Bolton Doctrine. Just to be clear, the Bolton Doctrine is not the title of a Frederick Forsyth novel based in Greater Manchester. It was an established legal principle. In Client Earth, Mr. Justice Holgate, who gave the judgment, held that Principles 2 and 6 of Bolton are no longer good law. I'm sure everybody remembers what Principles 2 and 6 are. To be honest, I had to look them up. To recap, Principle 2 in Bolton required a decision taker to consider a matter that might cause him or her to reach a different conclusion than if he left it out of account. Principle 6 entitled the court to quash a decision where it's clear that there's a real possibility that that consideration would have made a difference to the decision. So taking those 2 factors out of a material considerations challenge narrows considerably, in my view, the scope for such challenges. It's also noteworthy here that obvious materiality was couched in terms of rationality. So there now appear to be 2 categories of material considerations challenge. First, where the decision maker is expressly impliedly required to take a matter into account but fails to do so. And secondly, and the second category is necessarily fact-specific, and requires claimants to show that no reasonable authority would have left a particular consideration out of account. So that is a high bar indeed. So the next topic I'm going to look at is the one of judicial deference, and I've touched on that issue to an extent already. This question of judicial deference to decision makers is a trend that runs hand in hand with a resistance of the courts to the over-legalisation of the planning system and the oft-used expression nitpicking. But interestingly, nitpicking is not a new term in planning judgments. It first appeared, at least as far as I can tell, in the 1977 decision of Bradford City Council against the Secretary of State, which was a fascinating case concerning permitted development rights and a proposal to face a red brick house with stone tiles 1¼ inches thick. Now, I know everyone's waiting to know what the answer to that question was. Actually, planning permission was not required for the stone tiles. But that's where nitpicking, and given the nature of the issue involved in that case, it is perhaps not a surprise that the expression nitpicking was used in that 1977 judgment. Now, by using the expression judicial deference, I don't mean anything pejorative. Even though the extent to which the courts are prepared to get involved, usually indirectly, in the substantive merits of a case waxes and wanes, it's long been held that matters of planning judgment are for decision makers, not for judges. There's certainly a sense, since the Suffolk coastal litigation, which ended up in the Supreme Court, that the courts are especially reluctant to interfere with the findings of expert decision makers, such as inspectors, something of a presumption that they have understood the law and policy correctly. So the case that I'm going to use to illustrate this point, and that is, just to be clear, that's not my office, it's very tidy indeed. I'm using the linked cases of Gladman developments against the Secretary of State, although many other examples appear in my Journal of Planning and Environmental Law paper. So in these linked cases, the tilted planning balance was triggered by a lack of housing land supply. Gladman argued that the inspectors had misconstrued paragraph 11D(2) of the National Planning Policy Framework by considering development plan policies as part of the tilted planning balance. The Strategic Land Company argued for a two-stage test. First, carrying out the tilted planning balance under the framework, followed by the statutory balance under the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act 2004, section 38(6). The claims were dismissed. The court held that there was nothing in paragraph 11 which requires development plan policies to be excluded from consideration in the tilted balance, nor any established policy or principle that obliges decision makers to adopt a two-stage approach. It was a matter for inspectors how they structured, how they crafted their decision letters, provided that they addressed the correct policy and legal questions. So up to inspectors how they answered those questions. So Mr. Justice Holgate also observed that a proposal, this is on the substantive point, that a proposal may accord with a development plan, the most important policies of which are assessed as being out of date, or the footnote 7 trigger may apply because of a shortfall in housing land supply, but the development plan may be assessed as being up to date and attracting substantial or full weight. In either of those scenarios, taking account of development plan policies would not, said the judge, be inconsistent with the presumption in favour of sustainable development. So on the substantive issue, development plan policies can be taken into account in striking the tilted planning balance. The judge also, and then this point I've got some in parentheses in my notes, knowing glance to camera, gave some important guidance of wider application. First, the interpretation of policy, as we know, is an objective exercise, reading the policies in their proper context. But a slight gloss was placed on that. The context, said the judge, requires a consideration of the full range of circumstances in which the policy can be applied, and not through the lens of a disappointed party, usually a disappointed developer. So the lesson to be learnt there is that on any such challenge in the future, a significantly greater degree of legal objectivity is going to be required than has been hitherto the case. Secondly, the parties, and I think in particular advocates, were warned again to bear in mind the court's previous pronouncements to avoid wrapping up challenges to policy application in the cloak of an excessively legalistic interpretation point. And third, claimants have been told in no uncertain terms to stop, capital letters, filing witness statements that seek to show a pattern amongst decision makers. In this case, it was a series of decisions by inspectors which the claimant indicated showed a particular way of addressing policy questions. So it's this guidance, all of it, which is of wider application, which I think hammers home the fact that the scope for judicial intervention often is a relatively narrow one. So the Gladman cases do highlight actually one aspect of this corner of the planning world, setting aside the logical and linguistic gymnastics in which we sometimes engage in order to seek clarity in the understanding of high-level planning policy. The court does continue to provide an important supervisory role in standardising policy interpretation. So the Gladman cases, I think, strike an interesting balance between the judicial deference, which has been a feature of many planning judgments, particularly over recent years, but also indicating there is still a very important role for the courts to play when it comes in particular to policy interpretation. As we're about halfway through, this is going to be a brief interlude, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about my very, very favourite case of the year. It isn't necessarily my favourite case just because I acted for York City Council and we won. But looking at the photographs, one of those pictures is a donut. The other is the greenbelt around York. So York's greenbelt is a philosophical conundrum. I mean, what is it? Where does it come from? And how do we even know it's there? Mr. Justice Stuart Smith met these issues manfully, head-on. The claim in question concerned a challenge to the grant of permission for an extension to an existing neurological rehabilitation centre. The council, in a delegated decision, concluded that the site did not lie within the general extent of the York Greenbelt. The claimant disagreed and said the council got it wrong in concluding that the site wasn't within the Greenbelt. Now, that's a strange challenge because ordinarily, Greenbelt boundaries are fixed precisely by development plans. And so that wouldn't have been a challenge open to most claimants in the country. However, the history of the York Greenbelt is complex, so that at present the only policies in York's adopted development plan are two safe policies from the Yorkshire and Humber Regional Spatial Strategy. These policies establish the general extent of the Greenbelt, whose detailed inner boundaries were to be established in later development plan documents. Reassuringly, for the local planning authority and for those philosophers amongst us, the judge held that the regional spatial strategy established the principle of a green belt around York, but it was a matter of planning judgment whether any particular parcel of land fell within or outside the green belt in any given case. So, now to the donut point. There was a discussion about how to describe the York green belt. I offered polo mint, because I thought that was a descriptor that fitted with the permanence of a green belt. The learned judge, as he was entitled to do, referred to it as a donut. And if you look at the judgment, there are 14 references to donuts in this judgment of the planning court.
You must have had a sweet tooth.
Yes, I'm sure. Now, this is an update to the update. Now, it would have been nice if the courts had stopped handing down judgments in July, if only to make my paper seem bang up to date. But alas, that was not to be. So, a couple of cases which have appeared since July. The first one, Liverpool Open and Green Spaces Community Interest Company against Liverpool City Council, a case in which King's Chamber's very own Paul Tucker QC and Constanza Bell acted for Liverpool Council. This was a challenge by a community group to Liverpool's decision to grant permission for residential development in a green wedge, partly occupied by a miniature railway, seen on this slide, but also seen on the introductory slide. The site was within also the setting of some listed buildings. This is a Court of Appeal case. Few important points to note. This was the developer's appeal. Now, but having launched the appeal, it served a notice of discontinuance. Ordinarily, that would be the end of the matter, but Liverpool City Council wished to continue the appeal in the public interest. Now, just as a brief diversion, there are 3 requirements which have to be fulfilled before an appeal which had become academic between the parties could be allowed to proceed. Firstly, the appeal raises a point of general importance. Secondly, the respondent to the appeal agreed to it proceeding. And thirdly, both sides of the argument would be fully and properly ventilated. Now, those tests were met in this particular case, said the Court of Appeal, particularly because the case involved the interpretation of a local policy protecting green wedges, and it could have wider implications for the interpretation and application of greenbelt policy. So it was of sufficient public importance to hear the case out. One of the substantive grounds focused on the interpretation of policy OE3. It's the local policy I've just mentioned, protecting green wedges. And this is a relatively useful analysis by the Court of Appeal, helpful particularly for those local authorities who are often concerned about allowing development in any areas where there are protections in terms of its openness. So implying the policy imperative of preserving openness of the green belt or the green wedge required realism, common sense, and the exercise of planning judgment, avoiding an unduly legalistic approach unless an error of law was shown. So that indicates that it may be possible, using those different elements, common sense, realism, and the exercise of planning judgment, to grant planning permission for development in areas that are protected by openness policies, rather than getting hung up too much on the idea that granting permission for any development at all in open areas is always going to be unacceptable. So on that challenge, the local authority was successful. Where the council fared less well was in its handling of the detailed representations submitted by the community group. So they submitted on request, they were specifically consulted on these matters, on their view about the impact on the listed buildings. They produced a detailed response, but unfortunately the officer's report did not make a single mention of that representation by the community group in the report. That, said the court, was an obviously material consideration. Obviously material consideration being a concept we've looked at already in the Sam Smith's case and the Client Earth judgment. So the obviously material consideration that the council had left out of account, and that was a legal error. So there's a lesson for local authorities here. Make sure that officers' report properly include and take account of representations from third parties, especially organised groups, and certainly in circumstances where you've asked them for their own particular view on an issue. The next case, this is Aireborough Neighbourhood Development Forum against Leeds City Council, a challenge to an allocations plan. Before I go any further, the photograph I've used is Yeadon Town Hall. Yeadon's part of the Aireborough community. And in case you're interested, in 2021, some of these have been postponed from during lockdown, will host such stars from the entertainment firmament as Shawaddy and tribute bands such as T-Rextasy, and my own personal favourite, Bon Jovi, Jovi spelt G-I-O-V-I. Neighbourhood Development Forum, an organised group. One thing that's quite interesting about this case is that the White Paper Planning for the Future sees a role for neighbourhood planning in the bright sunlit uplands of the new system. And if you don't believe me, have a look at paragraph 2.56 of the White Paper. This challenge shows the potentially important role that organised neighbourhood planning groups can play, especially in relation to higher level policy proposals which affect their area. Now, this case requires something of a run-up to it. So, it was a challenge to an allocations plan that Leeds were promoting. Now, to backtrack a bit, the core strategy, after a relatively long gestation period, was adopted in 2014. The adopted housing requirement was 4,700 dwellings per annum. And in order to achieve the core strategy housing requirement, some 12,400 homes needed to be allocated in the Greenbelt. However, as the allocations plan was going through the process, the standard method was issued, standard method part 1. So the standard method housing requirement was 3,200 odd houses a year. Now across the plan period, that involved a reduction in the overall requirement of about 27,000 homes. Now, even my limited statistical ability indicates that that more than accounts for the amount of homes that would have been allocated in the Greenbelt in order to meet the core statutory requirement. What also happened at this stage is that in light of the standard method figure, which indicated quite a significant annual drop in housing, the local authority commenced a core strategy review alongside the site allocations plan. So that's the science bit before we get to the legal bit. The Neighbourhood Development Forum argued that the adoption of the Leeds site allocation plan was unlawful. There are a number of issues at play here. Given that the allocations plan included the allocation of over 12,000 homes in the Greenbelt, exceptional circumstances, I'm sure we all know, were required under the National Planning and Policy Framework. In the inspector's report, there were two inspectors. In the inspector's report, the only exceptional circumstances which they relied upon were the absolute level of housing needs set out in the core strategy. And in this regard, the court made a number of important findings. Mrs. Justice Leven giving the judgment. So the orthodox view that the function of an allocations plan is to follow the policies of a core strategy or a stage 1 local plan is not to be applied slavishly, especially where Greenbelt release is contemplated. It must be relevant to the exceptional circumstances test, held the judge, to consider whether the housing requirement was undermined by a change in policy, in this case, the introduction of the standard method. The forum argued strongly that Greenbelt land should not be released because in light of the change to the standard method, the introduction of the standard method, and the emerging core strategy review, there was no longer a need for any Greenbelt release, and thus there couldn't be any exceptional circumstances. Now, there can be no doubt that this was an important principal controversial issue in front of the inspectors. It may well have been the most important controversial issue. And in those circumstances, the judge said reasons should have been given for their findings that exceptional circumstances existed in light of the changing policy position. But what the judge didn't do was to find that it wasn't open to the inspectors, had they given proper reasons, to approve that extent of Greenbelt release, even in the face of a much reduced housing requirement going forward. Third important point was that the withdrawal of the allocations plan was an obvious response, a reasonable alternative in the terms of the Strategic Environmental Assessment regulations, given that it was a material change in circumstances. For those who want a bit of law, Save Historic Newmarket against Forest Heath District Council, 2011 case, which indicated that a material change in circumstances would require a reconsideration of the SEA. However, in this case, adopting a relatively pragmatic approach, the judge refused to quash the decision on that basis because the Neighbourhood Forum had anticipated the consequences of the standard method reducing the amount of housing and made detailed representations on that very point. In other words, there was no prejudice in those circumstances to the claimants. Incidentally, in a separate judgment given last month, in August, the allocations plan wasn't quashed in its entirety, but only those policies allocating Greenbelt land for residential or mixed-use development. Those were the policies that were set aside. What the Aireborough judgment underlines, in my view, it is the crucial role that the court performs in supervising increasingly complex legal and technical decisions, which many local authorities are faced with in our current planning system, and probably will be in our new planning system. And in fact, I see no particular reason for that, the importance of that supervisory role to change in the future. So that's my update to the update. And as I said at the beginning, that the final part of my talk is going to use a real crystal ball to look forward to the next year. The lady on the left is Crystal Ball, Crystal with a K. She's an American political pundit. Now, if she turned her mind to planning law, I'm sure she would say the following things. Firstly, I've got no doubt at all that the coming year will produce a rich tapestry of judgments. In fact, we won't have to wait too long, October, before the hugely significant case involving the challenge to the government's new permitted development rights brought by Rights Community Action will be heard in a rolled-up hearing in the Planning Court. So this claim, based on the Equalities Act, the SEA regulations, lack of consultation and a number of other grounds, will lay bare, I think, the extent to which the courts are prepared to rule on the lawfulness of secondary legislation. A case for our times, you might think. That, I firmly believe, is likely to be followed by other challenges over the next 12 months to high-level policy decisions. There are already rumblings about the new standard method. And if the government's changes to the planning system as a whole start coming out in any solid form over the next 12 months, they are unlikely to go unchallenged. The other area which I see as developing over the next year is that it's relatively likely, I think, that some decisions made during lockdown will be contested, perhaps with allegations of procedural unfairness at their heart, given that many decision takers have had to be more flexible in their application of the normally strict procedural rules. Now, we await the court's response to such arguments, although particularly given the fact that the courts responded very quickly, nimbly and well to lockdown by virtual hearings, I suspect they will be relatively sympathetic to decision makers who've had to take a similar responsive approach. Although the courts have responded extremely nimbly, as I've just said, and efficiently to the strictures of lockdown, there will inevitably be something of a backlog. In that regard, it will be no surprise, I think, to see the courts being ever more vigilant against merits-based challenges cloaked in legalistic language, as well as continuing their qualified deference towards the planning judgment of decision makers. So, to circle back to where I started, and to finish with this, using one of the time-honoured phrases of Dragon's Den, I'm out, but I will stay for questions. Thank you very much.
That was a fantastic presentation. And I know that there's a great paper. I should explain to everybody that Jonathan's paper will be online. It will be available online, but we're going to be asking you to fill in the survey. And once you've filled in the survey, you'll get the password and you'll be able to download the paper, which I assure you is a real good read. You mentioned that in your view there was no reason to change the supervisory role of the courts there just at the end, and I also noted earlier that you talked about judicial review being, quotes, fairly efficient. So I just wanted to kick off in the short time that we have available by just asking you for your views on the Ministry of Justice's independent review of administrative law. We've heard an awful lot about the white paper, big fanfare. But it seems to me that there's not much publicity going around at the moment about this independent review. And what are your reflections on this? Because the 6-week call for evidence ends on the 19th of October, and they are asking really some fairly fundamental questions, which suggest that if judicial review is written into law, that might be taken as an opportunity to limit judicial review. Is that necessary?
Well, can I start off by saying that one thing I think that everybody listening who has an interest in public law generally, but more specifically planning law, should respond to the call for evidence. And you've said, Mary, that the white paper came out to a fairly significant fanfare, both in the newspapers and on social media, whereas the call for evidence for the panel on judicial review was relatively quiet. I mean, my own view is that the reforms that have come in over the last 7 or 8 years have struck a fairly decent balance. So if you think about it, there's the permission stage has been focused on perhaps more than it has been in the past. Weak cases are weeded out at an early stage. We've got an expert tribunal who know their planning law, who can deal with cases efficiently. the protective costs orders which are used still allow those people without the funds but with a genuine interest in the planning system and planning policy decisions that affect them and affect the country generally to not be put off by the incredible costs that sometimes arise. So I think the balance is pretty right, and that's why I said in some of my remarks that what the Judicial Review Panel might do well in is to have a look at the way in which the planning court works at the moment. It works pretty well in my view, but I still think that, but you also mentioned that the possibility of codifying the grounds of judicial review. I don't think that is necessary. I think let's not kid ourselves that the consideration of codifying the grounds means that the scope for judicial review is likely to be narrower,
Indeed.
not wider.
Indeed, and one of the questions is which grounds and remedies should be available for claims against the government, as if to say claims against the government should be treated differently from other claims. Is there much basis for that in your view?
I don't think so. And I mean, it's in the news a lot recently, and I'm not going to make a political point, but the rule of law is big news at the moment. And we only have to look to a number of recent cases. One good example is the Plan B challenge to the third runway at Heathrow to demonstrate that the courts play a very effective role on occasions to holding the executive, holding government to account. I mean, these cases they're not every day, they are relatively rare, but when they do come along, it's important that we have a legal system, a court system, that feels able to examine in detail the lawfulness of executive decision-making.
Okay, we've got literally a couple of minutes left. Very quickly, we heard from Lord Kerslake about his views on the white paper. Yes, there's some good stuff in there. Reduction in time for the production of local plans. I'm sure we'd all welcome that. But what about the idea of the central government identifying objectively assessed housing need, but leaving the councils to decide on their own requirements, whilst at the same time removing the duty to cooperate? I mean, do you see that working?
In a word, no. No, because it may well be possible for a centrally calculated requirement to go to each individual local authority. And I mean, of course, there's a lot of talk at the moment about the only way in which that would probably work is if you change the boundaries of local government. And that's something that's probably coming over the hill.
Indeed.
But where I think there is an issue through the removal of the duty to cooperate is in relation to cross-boundary development, in particular infrastructure. So that's where, and let's face it, the duty to cooperate hasn't worked perfectly.
Indeed.
But where it has worked is in relation to large infrastructure projects which kickstart development across a number of different local authority areas without some sort of regional or sub-regional way of organising that sort of development. The removal of duty to cooperate, it raises a number of questions which I don't think the white paper at the moment answers, although I do appreciate the devil will, of course, be in the detail.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you for your all the work you've done on your marvellous paper and for coming in today and giving us a glimpse of it. We're running out of time, so I'm afraid it falls upon me to wrap matters up and to thank you all for listening, to say please don't forget to complete the survey, and to say stay safe, and I really hope that we'll all be able to come together next year at the Oxford Conference on the 17th to the 19th of September. Really looking forward to seeing you all then. Meanwhile, take care. Bye-bye.